Hello, everyone. Welcome to Cinema Mancuso, and this is Notes on the News. I'm Peter Mancuso, and this is the show where I break down the biggest stories in film, media, entertainment, and give you my thoughts. Typically, this is a show I do weekly on Tuesday nights, as you saw in like the little pre-roll. If you're new to the channel, please like this and subscribe. We're always happy when people stumble upon Cinema Mancuso here on YouTube. But this, as you can see by the title, this is a little different. This is impromptu. I literally scheduled this 10 minutes ago. I wasn't sure when I was going to do it today, so that's why I didn't want to set a definite time. But I figured now that the 2024 has closed and we are now a few days into 2025, I wanted to do a year in review of 2024. You know, this is a very special year, of course, for the channel. This is when I started this channel, and I have been doing the show essentially every week, save for I think there was 1 week. It was like because I was traveling. Every week since February. So I've basically been covering news in the film, media, entertainment world since the very beginning of 2024. So what I want to do now is I don't want to take too long. I've told myself this would not be a long stream, but if you know me, like I'm already rambling now, and it's already going longer than it probably needs to be or should be. But my goal is I want to go over the box office from the last year, kind of evaluate what was successful, and then I want to talk about the 5 biggest stories of the year, or at least what I consider the 5 biggest stories of the year. So if you haven't already, please like the live stream. It really, really helps, and don't forget to subscribe. So before talking about the biggest films of last year, I want to do some honorable mentions. And this is a section I've created for the films that opened in 2023, but opened kind of later, and had, made a decent amount of money into the next year. Because if you go on Box Office Mojo, which is where I source all of my box office figures for the show, when you look at by year, there are 2 options, either in-year releases or calendar releases. So calendar releases would be stuff like this, right? So the ranking you're seeing here, 27, 29, that is for when you account for films that were released in 2023 as well. Most of what we're going to be talking about today are just in-year releases, like just cutting out anything that came out the year before just to make things simple. But looking here, I did want to give a little bit of a shout out, right? So you have movies like Wonka and Migration, Anyone But You especially, right? That was a movie that did not open very big. It did not get great reviews, but it was just something that kept holding week after week, to the point where in 2024 alone, it made, over $63 million. And Wonka, I think, is the huge... Again, it is the number 1 2023 movie for 2024. Made over $85 million domestically. And of course, this is all domestic. But $85 million in 2024 for a film that opened the year prior. And this was also one, I started this channel in February. I believe this was still in the top 10, as well as Migration, Anyone But You. These were films that just kept holding week after week. So by February, they were still, they weren't near the top of the top 10, but they were certainly in it and were holding and had a lot of staying power. Also, interestingly, you have Aquaman, right? This is the kind of the whimper, the DCEU died not with a bang, but with a whimper, right? And this was the last DCEU movie, but despite falling below the projections and probably not having a very good ROI based off the budget, and also compared to the original Aquaman film, which made like over $1 billion, with all that in mind, this sequel was a disappointment. But just in terms of numbers, it did pretty well. Again, well enough to be in the top 50 calendar releases for 2024. So before moving forward, I just wanted to acknowledge these. But going forward, everything we're talking about are 2024 releases. So what I've done is that I basically made a chart, and I did the top 50 movies. So... And I ranked them, so this list, for example, is ranked by the total amount of gross domestic box office results, right? Now, what we're going to do is I want to go through and kind of rank them by the different metrics. And the flaw with that, potentially, is that you may have had something that was like 51, so it wasn't on my chart, but when you rank it by domestic multiples, it may have ended up in that top echelon, right? So this isn't a foolproof system, but I think it gives us a pretty good idea of what was successful, and in what ways were films successful, right? Because a film can be successful even if it doesn't make over $1 billion, right? So looking at this top 10, reading 1 to 10, we have, or actually, let me do 10 to 1. We have Kung Fu Panda 2, Godzilla x Kong: The New Empire, Twisters, Dune Part 2, Beetlejuice, Despicable Me 4, Moana 2, Wicked, which is interesting that it did beat Moana too, Deadpool and Wolverine, and at number 1, the highest grossing movie of the year, Inside Out 2. I did some research because I was like, is this the first time that an animated movie's been the highest grossing movie of the year? And I did some research. I think it was Finding Dory. Back in 2016, that was the last time. So it's been a long time. Notably, every single one of these movies is based off of something, right? With the exceptions of, I guess, Twisters, which is a sequel to Twister, but really has nothing to do with it. But definitely was leaning on the branding of that. And then I guess Wicked, but Wicked is a weird case because it's based off of a musical, which itself is like a prequel side story to a very established property. So what you're seeing here, and again, the number one lesson, if you're going to learn anything from Cinema and Q, so it's this: Hollywood always takes the wrong lessons from success and failure. So this isn't a new lesson, but this just reinforces Hollywood's modus operandi that established properties do the best. Just in terms of sheer numbers brought in, right? Because again, look at Inside Out 2, almost $653 million domestically. It's interesting because a lot of these movies aren't particularly great, right? So like Moana 2, I mean, this happens every year, right? But something like Moana 2 is really interesting that it did so well this year. And another note about all this list is that, you know, this is just 2024. So some of these movies released later in the year still have time to keep making more money, right? But something like Moana 2 is weird because it seems to have had, it was released a little more than a month ago, right? It was released right before Thanksgiving. I feel like it's had zero cultural impact. And something being good, it doesn't necessarily have to be good to have a cultural impact. So like, take a look at something like Mufasa, right? That movie got basically almost the same level of critical reception of just kind of, right? I went to go see it. It was still meh, but it was a net positive. It was a lot better than it had been made out to seem. But the song from it about brothers, like, what did you say about my brother? Like, that's become a meme, right? And love him or hate him, Lin-Manuel Miranda knows how to write songs that just, like, dig into your brain, like these little earworms, right? Notably, the original Moana had, if you think about the biggest hits from Disney when it comes to like their music, from like the last decade or so, it's been Lin-Manuel Miranda stuff. It's been you know, not always, because The Little Mermaid, any of the new songs in the Little Mermaid live action movie didn't really take off or anything, but you know, Moana had a lot of, you know, How Far I'll Go and You're Welcome, and Kanto, like, we don't talk about Bruno, like Lin-Manuel Miranda just has something intuitive about knowing what's gonna kind of burrow their way into your head and your heart, right? So it's interesting how much money Moana 2 made, but I think that was because of just how big of how popular that brand is with a certain generation, because of things like streaming, where, you know, you could just have Moana playing, you know, constantly, but replaying it over and over and over. A little disappointing to see Dune Part 2 lower. This was at one time the biggest movie domestically of the year and worldwide. But of course it was very early in the year, because I think it came out February, right? So it's going to be interesting to see how well this does. I feel like it's lost a lot of awards. It's lost a lot of awards momentum. It's been getting nominations for stuff, but whereas at the beginning of the year I would have thought this was a top contender for something like Best Picture, now it seems less and less likely every day. But then Wicked is here, right? So Wicked has been a huge financial powerhouse. You know, and if you look, I also have like a domestic percent column here. Kind of giving you a sense, and this isn't necessarily good or bad, like, it's not like the bigger the number, the better or worse, but, you know, just to give you a sense of how much of its gross was coming from, you know, the United States, or North America, I should say, right? Whereas something like Moana 2 is only 44%. Wicked is like 60, almost 2/3, right? Or I think more than 2/3. So, you know, it kind of shows here what movies are successful and where they were successful. Because if you look at, again, like Twisters, even more than Wicked, it's like 72%, right? So certain movies are going to make bank. And if you look at the total worldwide column, the ordering is more or less the same if you were to rank it by that, but there would be some flipping, right? So Despicable Me 4 would be much higher, Dune Part 2 would be much higher, but obviously, again, these are American films, so only certain kinds of American films are going to do well overseas, partially, you know, is there anything that's going to be lost in translation culturally, right? And animated films and action films always do better overseas because they're not as contingent on the dialogue and understanding cultural nuances and things like that. So this is our top 10 from 2024. But now what I want to do is kind of, like I said, sort them by some of these different columns and kind of see if we can glean anything from that. So looking at the domestic opening, so the biggest domestic opening of the top 50 was Deadpool and Wolverine. So interestingly, despite making less total, it opened much bigger, right? And by much, right, is in quotations, right? But it had a $211 million opening. Again, for a franchise, if you want to call it that, a franchise that was, if it's MCU adjacent, it's kind of the last kind of hurrah for the Fox X-Men kind of world. So it was, I don't want to say surprising to see this do so well, but again, a lot of people, what was surprising were the implications people were drawing from it. That this meant that the MCU was back on track, as if this wasn't a strange one, as if this wasn't like a one-off outlier. So, you know, our next MCU movie, I think is this upcoming February with the new Captain America movie. That will be the test, right? And that will determine was Deadpool Wolverine the exception or the rule? But again, looking at the domestic openings, it's all basically from the original top 10 except Sonic the Hedgehog 3, right? So this is only at 18 for in the top 50 when it comes to total domestic. And again, this is still a fairly recent movie. It only came out a couple weeks ago, so this will surely go up. But it had but when it comes to opening, I mean, the opening isn't going to change, right? It's already open. So it was able to squeak into this top 10 here. You know, and again, looking here, all no original films here, right? And that's the trend, is that everything we see here is based off of something, right? Which is unfortunate, but it's not always a bad thing, because again, something like Wicked and Dune Part 2 are like some of the best films ever made, right? At least in my opinion. But it's usually, you know, you're starting at a disadvantage creatively. And then I also want to look at domestic multiples. So this is a metric that we use. And basically, it's a number formulated by taking the total domestic gross and dividing it by the opening. And what that reveals is the bigger the number of, the bigger the result, rather, the more, the longer it held out, right? The more money it made after its opening. Because what you don't want is that it opens really big, and, you know, like, you don't want to have a movie that makes $100 million and $60 million was made in its opening weekend. Because what that means is that people didn't come back. It means word of mouth was really bad. So a bigger domestic multiple is an indicator of the longevity and the staying power of some of these films. So the number one, at least of the top 50, right? Because again, if I had done more than 50, maybe some others would have sorted up here. But looking just at the top 50 films, Despicable Me 4, which was at number 5, right, for total domestic gross, is now number 1, right, with a domestic multiple of 4.8. So, you know, nearly So the opening is about a fifth of its total gross, right? Domestically. And again, we see when sorting it like this, we see a lot of films jump. So Conclave, which was at 46, is now number 2. The Forge, which is like a movie I really don't know anything about, is also now in the top 5. Inside Out 2 is still here. It was not just a big money maker, but it did have it was sustainable. But again, yeah, things like The Wild Robot. I mean, look at most of these, I think, except for 3. So the only ones that were in the top 10 proper were Despicable Me 4, Inside Out 2, and Wicked. And everything else here was not in the top 10, but was in the top 50, right? So like one of the best here, I think, going back to Conclave, that was something that didn't have a big opening, but has kind of grown its distribution and is getting a lot of awards buzz, right? Something like Reagan, right? Like this Ronald Reagan biopic that did not make a lot of money, didn't really make back its budget. It did on paper, but it, ideally you want to double your budget, to cover marketing and advertising costs. That one held out pretty well. Again, it's not about making a lot of money, it's about the sustainability. So, and also The Wild Robot. This was one that was really great to see. And this is one I talked about a lot week after week, that this was a film that was not expected to open big, but the hope was that it would have kind of a similar journey as Elemental from the year before, the Pixar movie, that had a almost disastrous opening, whereas this wasn't disastrous, it just was small, but held out week after week after week to get to a place where it, its final totals were quite strong. And then another metric I want to look at here is percent return, right? So, you can make a shit ton of money, but if you spent a lot of money, did you really make that much? So what I've done is, again, this is only for the top 50, divided, found the percent return from the budget versus the total worldwide gross, factoring in all the other regions besides North America. And the biggest by far was Terrifier 3. This was a third film in the Terrifier franchise, which itself was like a spin-off of like a horror anthology movie, if my understanding is correct. A 4,300% return. That's insane. If these numbers are accurate, it only had a budget of $2 million. So it only ranked 35 in the normal ranking, because it only brought in 54 total. But considering how cheap it was, that's a great ROI. And again, Hollywood always takes the wrong lessons. But if they were to take a right lesson, I would hope it would be this, that, you're, and I forget the name of the guy, but the guy who did American Fiction from last year, that awards movie. And he said, instead of making one $200 million movie, why don't you, and you being studios, why don't you make 10, $20 million movies, right? So hopefully seeing some of these percent returns here, maybe incentivize some major studios to, instead of making that one really big movie, make a bunch of smaller ones, which are going to result in more creative films, and also diversifies the risk. Because the reason why they're called tent poles is because, you only have a couple tent poles to hold up the whole tent. So if you kick out one of the poles, the whole tent's going to come down. So, it's in their best interest to, not have as many huge movies. Another movie that did really, really well was It Ends With Us, right? The adaptation of the very popular romantic drama novel about emotional abuse and domestic violence. That did very well, again, considering its budget. So it was made for about $25 million. It grossed over $350 million worldwide. A 1,300% return. And again, if you're looking here, this batch of these top ranking films based off percent return, most of them were not in the top 10. Maybe most is an exaggeration. Let's see. Terrifier 3 Ends With Us, Long Legs, The Forge. So half of these were not in the top 10. And again, some of them were really low, like something like The Forge, which had really good legs, was only made for $5 million, and it made $40+ million, right? Long Legs was also a really big, I remember when that was coming out. Until Terrifier 3 came out, I remember going, Long Legs is like this great success story that, again, illustrates why Hollywood loves to make horror films, because they're cheap, but they usually have the ceiling is pretty low, but so is the floor, right? So, you know, the minimum amount of money that you're going to make off of a horror film is like pretty standard, right? So if you can keep the costs down, you can make a pretty decent percent return, if not a decent total gross. Longlegs was also one that had pretty good staying power. Unlike It Ends With Us and Terrifier 3, these are good domestic multiples, but they're not the best. Like, obviously they're not going to rank at the top when you measure by that metric. And interestingly, The Strangers Chapter 1, this was like a very horror film that came out that was supposed to have 3 films come out this year, like one in June or whatever, and then another in August, and then it never, I don't remember any of the ones coming out. So it must have not done well enough. But again, the percent return makes it worth it, because it only made $48 million, but it only cost $8.5 million. So as someone who's always trying to figure out how much can you squeeze out of every dollar, these kinds of films are really exciting. And then one final metric that no one else is going to do, I figured why not try to factor in all of these different metrics. So what I did was I basically multiplied all of these metrics and then divided it by the budget. So that, you know, if you didn't make a lot of money, but you had a really high domestic multiple, your score is going to be higher. And then I ranked them from there. And doing that adjusted ranking, again, a lot of these are still from the top 10, but there are some interesting changes. So, of course, Despicable Me 4 jumps up a bunch of spots. Terrifier 3 makes it into this top 10. Longlegs, these films that, again, aren't going to be at the top of those lists just off of pure dollars, but it has a lot of other stuff going for it. And I think the industry would be in a much better place if studio and distributors understood that the goal isn't to make $1 billion off of one movie. It's about, however you make the money, you make the money. So you're better off making a bunch of smaller projects that are more creatively interesting, don't have the weight of the world on their shoulders. Because that's why big budget movies are always so meh, is because they can't afford to take risks. They're too big to fail. So, I think it would be better for everybody. It would be better for their diversifying their risk, and for us to have a lot of different kinds of films. And speaking of distributors, I just want to do one last thing before moving on, is looking at the top 5 distributors, again, just domestically. Though if you rank by worldwide, it's the same list, but the last 2 are just flipped. So top distributors for the year were Sony Pictures releasing, Paramount Pictures, Warner Brothers, Universal, and Disney. Disney bringing in almost $2 billion domestically, a little over $4 billion with a B worldwide. And again, these are the usual suspects. If I'd done the top 10, you would have seen things like 20th Century Studios or A24 Neon. But again, this is the ball game, right? We are still an industry dominated by mega corporations, and Paramount may not even exist anymore soon. So, or it will, but in a kind of a new form. And we still very much live in the studio system that was created, from the mid 20th century onward. Okay, let me grab a quick drink here. Okay, so what I'm going to try to do now, I don't want to take a lot of time doing this, but what I want to do now is go through what I consider to be the top 5 stories from this year. If you have any comments or questions about any of these, feel free to drop them in the live chat. I'd love to kind of get a conversation started, because I wrote no notes for this. I'm doing this completely raw, just thinking about the stories and their impact, especially some of these weeks or months later. So number 5 is Muppet Vision 3D closing. Now, maybe most other publications wouldn't put this as one of their top 5 biggest stories, but I just think this is such a huge tragedy. This, of course, is the very popular and iconic Muppets-themed attraction at Disney's Hollywood Studios at Disney World in Florida. One of the last, I think maybe the last thing Jim Henson worked on before he passed away. It's this incredible kind of 4D cinematic experience, right? And it's been announced, Disney announced that they're going to be closing it to make room for a Monsters Inc. themed area. Disney, when it comes to their theme parks, I feel like have really lost their way with everything. It's just become the IP-ification of the experience. And of course, intellectual properties and franchises were always part of Disney parks' DNA and brand, but to the point where they're not even trying. It's Toy Story Land. Like that's as late. Like that's a working title, right? There was never lands based off of just a single franchise, but of course that was in response to Universal doing the Wizarding World of Harry Potter, right? That scared the shit out of Disney and went, we have to copy that. So that's why you get Toy Story Land, or more specifically things like Star Wars Galaxy's Edge and Pandora, right? The Avatar-themed land in Animal Kingdom. So it's, you know, at the end of the day, it's one franchise kicking another franchise out. So it's not like, you know, the end of the world here, but just in terms of the creativity of Muppet Vision 3D, it's just a great attraction. It's great for crowds because it's a big theater, so it can eat up a bunch of crowds who don't want to wait in the long lines and need something to do. It's air conditioned, it's a place to sit for a bit. So I think it's just a really big shame that we're losing this. There's been some talks that maybe they'll move it to another part of the park, like Animation Courtyard and Star Wars Launch Bay. I really hope that they do that, because again, with theme park attractions, there's just no media preservation per se, right? Like once something's gone, it's gone, and you can't experience it anymore. So that would really be a shame if Jim Henson's last work and one of the most creative just ceases to exist and be accessible to anyone ever again. And story number 4, the number 4 top story, is the Paramount Skydance merger saga. This was something I covered all year. It felt like, I think it started like in the spring and went through the summer. This constant back and forth of will they, won't they. You know, Skydance Media, created and owned by David Ellison, son of tech mogul Larry Ellison. He wanted Skydance to buy Paramount Pictures. Paramount Pictures has been in a very precarious kind of situation. It's definitely one of the least successful of the major distributors in American film companies at this point. And, you know, something has to change. I've said this many times on the channel that, you know, Paramount cannot survive with business as usual. They're going to have to do something different, because what they have been doing just has not worked. There was, again, all this back and forth because there were certain terms of the deal that would really benefit Sherry Redstone here, who is the owner of National Amusements, which itself is the majority shareholder of Paramount. You know, the original terms of this Skydance acquisition, you know, disproportionately favored her as opposed to regular shareholders. So, you know, there was a lot of back and forth about that, and maybe the deal wasn't going to go through. And there was a period where they seemed like they broke up, that they weren't going to do it anymore. Sony entered the mix at one point, maybe saying, well, maybe we'll buy Paramount. That could be interesting. Add it to our kind of stable. They finally figured it out. They finally worked out the details that seemingly is going to make everyone happy, or at the very least, the people who are unhappy, they're satisfied enough where they're not going to cause a big uproar about it. But as of very recently, this may all be up in the air again, because now Trump, you know, now that he's been reelected, you know, he's not happy with CBS, which is part of Paramount. CBS, of course, did the 60 Minutes interview with Kamala Harris, and they, you know, used one part of one of her answers for a promo, and then a different part of the answer for the actual program. And Trump was calling this false advertising and election interference and all this stuff. So, you know, now that he's reelected, he's signaled that he's going to direct, you know, there's already, the FCC is already suggesting that they might block this deal, right? Because essentially it's political retribution. So after everything that the whole spring and summer that we talked about this might be up in the air again. But I think this story is interesting because, again, it's one of these legacy media companies. You know, it's the first casualty, right? That, you know, this is each of the studios are gonna have to face the same things Paramount's facing now. They're just the first to do so because they're in the weakest position. But the entertainment industry is contracting and expanding in a really weird paradoxical way, and it's just making it a very uneasy, unsettling, and uncertain environment. So that's why I found this story so fascinating. That it's what is Paramount going to do? Because this is going to set the tone for the next decade of entertainment company mergers, reorganizations. Because not too long ago now, Comcast announced they're going to be basically spinning off almost all of their cable channels except Bravo, right? Which they would never do because it has the Real Housewives and they don't want to get rid. They want that part. So we're seeing all these companies trying to figure out how do they exist in a new ecosystem. And Paramount is just the most visible, obvious, because it's just in the weakest position. But this is going to happen for all of them. Story number 3, the third biggest story of the year, the death of Liam Payne. So this was a huge surprise to everybody. This is one of the, he was one of the members of the boy band One Direction, of course, who came to fame in like the 2010s, I believe, like the early 2010s. English boy band from, they discovered on X Factor. Or rather, they weren't discovered, they were kind of created on X Factor. Like, none of the kids knew each other. And he's the one that, unfortunately, like, I really hate to say this, he was kind of like the least popular one. I'm not a 1D fan necessarily. I like some of their music, but I'm not intimately involved with all the details of the fandom and the lore. But from my understanding, he was almost kind of portrayed as like the dad of the group, like the sensible one. But that inevitably makes you the least interesting one. So he struggled a lot with addiction, substance abuse, and he ended up dying. I think it was in Argentina during like a drug-fueled kind of mania, and he supposedly was just trying to escape his room. I guess there's like new details coming out, and he like fell off the balcony and he died. So it's just really upsetting, and the reason why this was so, I think, revelatory is that it just shines a light on child stardom and how we put children in these positions where their brains have not fully formed, right? They say, I feel like they're always increasing the age, so like they're eventually just gonna say your brain hasn't fully developed until you're 65, right? But they say like the brain doesn't fully develop until you're like 25, or maybe now it's 26 or 27. He became a global superstar when he was like 16, 17 years old, or 18 maybe. That the brain is not designed for that kind of power. Not so much power, but fame, attention, access to anything and everything you could want. So when that dries up, or even if it doesn't dry up, it's gonna, your brain is still moldable. So it's gonna create these psychochemical conditions, that we see in so many child stars turned adults. I make it sound like, oh, they turned into adults. Like, they all turn into adults, unless unfortunately they die too young. But, again, and why do we do this? Because of money, right? Because adults find a way to make money off of it, and they kind of glob onto the talent and success of children, and let's call it what it is, children, and they either actively create dangerous conditions for them or turn a blind eye to them because it's making them a shit ton of money. So it's just another young talent lost way too soon. And I think this happened back in October, and it still feels surreal. And I don't even really care about One Direction. So especially, if you were a 1D stan growing up, it's like losing a friend or something. That's how a lot of people seem to describe it. It's like losing a family member almost. So that was just a really shocking moment that hopefully maybe leads to some change, but unfortunately it probably won't. And then the number 2 story of 2024 was Joe Biden's disastrous debate performance that ultimately led him to drop out of the presidential race. So this was like watching a car wreck. I watched it live from the minute the guy shuffled out. And my grandfather was 82 when he passed away. This is more than a decade ago. And those last maybe 5 or 6 years of his life were characterized by the shuffling, right? That's how you know you're really old, is the shuffling. Like where your legs are stiff, right? That's how the leader of the free world, the most powerful man on the planet, shuffled his way out on this debate stage. And from the minute he walked out, I knew this is not going to go well. And if anything, that was a high point. What the debate showed was what many had suspected for years, that he was in no position to be running for president again, and arguably was in no position to be president in that moment. And of course, if you watch this channel, you know I am not coming at this from a conservative angle, but from like a far left angle. Like I'm very, very left wing. So take all this with a grain of salt. Don't think because I'm bashing Joe Biden that I'm like a MAGA person, right? I'm coming at it from the other side. But it just became so clear, you know, stumbling, not being able to put sentences together, word salad, to the point where Donald Trump seemed to be the cogent alternative. Donald Trump, that's insane. And Donald Trump got some good jabs at him, like objectively, unironically funny comebacks where, you know, Joe Biden was like, blah, 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 and then Trump was like, I don't know what he said. I don't think he knows what he said either. Anyway, like that doomed it. And after watching that, I knew, and I stayed up for like 3 more hours after the debate and watched CNN to hear the crisis, the meltdown. And it was only within maybe 2 or 3 weeks Joe Biden announces that he was dropping out. And the reason why, because I usually don't just do news stories. I try to do things that were related to film, media, entertainment. And what I had said at the time, and I stand by this, is the reason why I covered this is because it shows that legacy media is not dead. That it was not a TikTok that unraveled his campaign. It was not social media. It was a live televised debate on a major television news network, right? Not to say that those networks haven't been diminished greatly, but they still have a place, right? They still have a place to shape national opinion, and that's why debates are so important, right? Because they, especially if it's a new candidate, sometimes like the first time that the average voter is getting a chance to meet them in a sense. But what this debate revealed was that, you know, Joe Biden was just no longer fit for the job. And it seems like people have come out. It seems like people knew this well into even like 2022. But Biden was stubborn and was like, I think I can beat Trump, even though internal polling was telling him that, you know, Kamala lost. But if Joe Biden had stayed, it would have been like a LBJ or Reagan level wipeout in favor of Trump. So it's the reason why live television or watching something live is so special, because I get to watch this train wreck in real time. And for that, I wouldn't give that up for anything, except maybe universal health care and better working conditions for the working class. Perhaps. And then the number one story of 2024, Robert Downey Jr. is returning to the Marvel Cinematic Universe as a multiversal version of Victor Von Doom, aka Dr. Doom. This was a surprise in the sense that I was not expecting it, which of course is the definition of a surprise. But it's not surprising in the sense that it feels like something that Disney and Marvel would do, right? Because of course, like I talked about many times on this channel, Marvel has really been in a malaise period since Endgame, right before COVID. You know, Deadpool Wolverine might be the exception, right? That proves the rule. But people were just not liking the direction this was going in. Of course, Jonathan Majors was going to be playing Kang. I almost said Kong. Playing Kang. And he was going to be like the new Thanos level threat. But of course, Jonathan Majors' career unraveled with personal scandals. So it was a lot of debate. Well, what are they going to do? Are they going to recast Kang? Are they going to bring in a different villain like Dr. Doom? So it seemed like Dr. Doom was the most likely replacement. Those rumors were flying around, and that seemed pretty certain. The fact that Robert Downey Jr. was going to be playing him was the big surprise. That moment. So if you see in this picture above me, they brought out all these guys when they announced that Avengers Doomsday was like the next one. They brought all these guys dressed as Dr. Doom, and then one guy kind of steps out and takes off his mask, and it's Robert Downey Jr., right? And that felt like a very big moment, but again, it represents kind of the cynical, business-mindedness of the creative direction of this company. That, I think Robert Downey Jr. is going to do a really good job, and I really like him. He's a really great actor, so it would be really cool to see him sink his teeth into a different kind of character, but it kind of reeks of desperation, right? It really does feel like, hey, general audiences, you loved Robert Downey Jr. Here he is, and he's back, right? And it just feels like it doesn't matter how good it ends up being. In its conception, in its inception, it's shallow, right? Let's just cast a guy that everyone likes and just as a different character. So I think, and a lot of people kind of went, this is it. The MCU is dead. I don't know if it's dead. I think this could be if this isn't good or doesn't do well financially, because it doesn't matter if it's good. If it does well, then they'll keep going in that direction. But if this doesn't do well, this Avengers Doomsday, I think they're going to do a whole factory reset. I think they're just going to do, through multiversal shenanigans, the entire universe gets wiped. Or at the very least doesn't get wiped like it exists. That'd be really sad if all the characters you knew and loved, not only don't they don't just die, they get wiped from reality itself. But my point is, I think they'll do a reset and they'll start a new cinematic universe and kind of start from scratch, which I think might be in Marvel's best interest, because now they have all the toys, right? They have all the stuff Fox had. They have deals so they can work in Spider-Man. They have the whole roster now, as opposed to when they started the MCU. The whole conceit was kind of doing whatever they could with the characters they already had the rights to. So that's why that first phase is Iron Man, Captain America, Thor. Iconic characters, no doubt, but not the biggest characters when it comes to the public consciousness. Like, because in 2008, the most liked Marvel characters, popular would be like Spider-Man, the X-Men, Fantastic Four, the Hulk. So now they're in a completely different position. So I think that would be their best move, and I think that's where they're working towards. I think they're just trying to squeeze every last drop of milk out of the cow that is this universe of the MCU. But it was a surprise, no doubt, and that's why this really does feel like a YouTube video. And that's why that was the number one story of 2024. Okay, just want to give a few quick plugs before wrapping up. This isn't my only YouTube channel. I have a sister channel called Peter Squared, where I cover topics related to film, media, entertainment, in a more structured video essay format. The video I have up is called A Closer Look at Frozen, where, you guessed it, I take a closer look at the Disney film Frozen, taking a look at what went right, what went wrong, and everything in between, using these cartoon older and younger versions of myself. It's a lot of fun. I would really appreciate if you go check that out. You can find it in the description down below. And I also want to give a plug to the podcast I do with my fiance Viviana called Now That's What I Call a Franchise, where we pick a film franchise and we go through every single installment, the good, the bad, and the ugly. This last season we did Star Wars, which was so much fun. You can listen to all of our episodes on that. We're about to start in the next coming weeks. We're going to be starting The Lord of the Rings, Middle-earth, Hobbit, all of that stuff. You can find us wherever you get your podcasts. You can also find us on YouTube if that's your preferred way to podcast. And you can also find us in the link down in the description below. And then finally, I want to give a plug to Cineman Q. So it's not just a YouTube channel. It started, as it still is, a Substack newsletter where I write written reviews for new movies coming out. I've been doing it for almost 3 years now. I have over 100 reviews up. It's been a lot of fun. I would really appreciate if you could go check that out. You can find the link to that in the description down below, or you can just go to your browser and type in cinemanqso.substack.com. Again, once again, thank you all so much for watching. If you haven't yet, please like this live stream. It really, really helps with engagement and the algorithm and people finding the channel. And speaking of which, if you have stumbled upon this channel, subscribe, because we're trying to grow the community. So maybe one day I can monetize these videos and make $10 a year and devote even more time to this. But I guess if you don't want me to spend more time on this, then subscribe anyway. Do it! I command you all to subscribe. Without further ado, thank you all so much. Until next time, peace out.